Thank you, Dan. Okay. Brian, you can go ahead. I think you can turn this down a little bit because I'm talking quietly right now. Okay, maybe not that much. We'll see. I just don't know how riled up I'm going to get this morning. Okay. So, many of you may know, some of you may know Mark Halleck. He is the pastor of Calvary Englewood, which is our sending church. We are a replant in the Calvary family of churches, and our sending church is Calvary Englewood, and the lead pastor there is Mark Halleck. And I've known Mark for many years. We've known each other since we were kids, and I remember he has, he's an individual that I listen to. He has a lot of wisdom, and I remember one time I was talking with him. We were talking about being a pastor, and he just said, he goes, Kevin, here's the thing. Here's what you just have to realize about being a pastor. He says, no matter what you do, okay, people are just going to think you're weird. He's like, there's nothing you can do about it. He's like, it doesn't matter if you watch all the right movies and listen to all the right music and drink the right coffee. It doesn't matter if you wear skinny jeans, right? It doesn't matter if you like can go native, can like totally go hip and cool and be whatever it is. It doesn't matter. People are still just going to think you're weird. And I have found that to be true. Time and time again. I'll find myself in some sort of social interaction. Maybe I'm at a party, and I'm hanging out with folks that are not a part of the church, and I'm doing pretty well. We're talking movies. Yeah, man, I've seen that movie. I love that part where or did you see the game last night? Oh yeah, wasn't that awesome? Who are you for, man? The Broncos stink. Yeah, And I'm doing great. I mean, I'm just fitting in all this, and then they'll ask, say, hey, so what do you do? And I'm like, oh, I'm a pastor. And it's like in those Western movies when an out-of-towner walks into the saloon, comes in the doors and the jukebox, that the music just stopped. That's what it's like when I say I'm a pastor. And Mark's right. Just when you're a pastor, people just think it's weird. Today we're continuing in the series that we actually began it many months ago, then we took a break during the season of Advent, and now we're back in it. It's a series called The Story. And the central theme of this whole series is that if you want to understand any passage in the Bible, you've got to set it within the context of the story. That the Bible is a story. It is a story that it unfolds in 4 acts: creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. And if you want to understand any passage in the Bible, you have to set it in that story. And the reality is there are passages of the Bible, I think many of us will come across a passage from time to time where we read it and we're more confused than we were before we read it, right? We come to the Bible looking for something that's going to help us with life, help to kind of bring some clarity to the confusion that we experience on a day-to-day basis, and then we read a given passage and we're more confused than when we began. Kind of like the passage that was read today, right? This is a perfect example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. The Deuteronomy chapter 14 is not, I've never met anybody where it's their favorite chapter of the Bible. Not one. Not one. I mean, there's, there are chapters people love. Some people love John chapter 1. That's a great passage. Others, if you're theologically sophisticated, you'll pick something from Romans. I like Romans 8 or Romans 9. Then you're really, whoa, you like Romans 9, But I've never heard anybody say Deuteronomy chapter 14, right? The reality is it's weird. And the reality is, to understand how this passage relates to our own lives, we must set it within the context of the story. And what's interesting is that the passage itself alludes to the story, okay? We find this actually in the first verse. Verse 1, you are the sons of the Lord your God. You are the sons of the Lord your God. And the word Lord is translated, is a translation of the divine name. And it is the name that is given to Moses at the time of the Exodus. And it's given with the purpose of there being a name that the Israelites would use of God, and it would remind them of their captivity in Egypt and their deliverance from Egypt. That when they would hear the divine name, when they would think of the divine name, they would associate it with the salvation that came out of Exodus. In other words, it would point them to the story. It would point them to the story of the people of Israel in captivity in Egypt, and then God bringing them out. So right here in this passage where it says, you are the sons of the Lord, it's referring them to the story. We see that it points to the story again in verse 2. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. And this phrase, you are his treasured possession, this is key, because what this points back to is it goes even further back in the story of the people of God. It goes back farther than Moses. It goes all the way back to Abraham, where Abraham and then his descendants are referred to as God's treasured possession. So it's reminding them, you are part of this entire story. And indeed, pointing back to the story of Abraham reminds them what the whole story is about. And it reminds them what their purpose is as the people of Israel. We see every time we go back to the story of Abraham, we are reminded that when God called Abraham and called his descendants, called them to be a people, and called them for himself, he did not just call them to be saved from something. He saved them for something. He saved them for a purpose. He tells Abraham, I will bless you. I will protect you from the nations. But then why is he going to bless Abraham? Why is he going to protect them from the nations? So that all nations can be blessed through Abraham. That ultimately the reason that God calls them and indeed rescues them, moving forward into the story of Moses, he rescues them so that they can get back to the task with which they were originally assigned, and that is blessing the nations. So many years ago, and I can't remember if I've told this story or not, but I went rafting with a group of guys. It was a guy's bachelor party. This is kind of in college or just right after college, kind of in those years. And my brother and I, we kind of grew up rafting, and we took these guys rafting for my friend's bachelor party. And it was, actually, it was pretty amazing because it was some pretty tough guys. There were like 2 guys on the University of Wyoming football team, and actually maybe 2 or 3, and then my brother's a pretty big guy, and then there's me, right? So just a bunch of really big, tough guys on this rafting trip. And so we're feeling like we're going to be able to conquer this, no matter what comes our way, we can handle this. So we get in the raft, and we're going down, and well, as it turns out, we were completely in over our heads. And literally, in our heads went over is maybe a better way of putting it. And there comes this point when everybody falls out of the boat, except for my brother. He was the guide. And he made one of the most miraculous rafting saves I've ever seen in my life. The boat was flipping over. Everybody falls out. He jumps up, tackles the top of the boat, and brings it back down, right? And I see this as I'm falling into the river, right? Okay, so what happens at that point? Well, my brother immediately comes and rescues me, right? I mean, there's 5 other guys there. He pulls me out. I'm his brother. I'm his treasured possession, right? So he rescues me out. But then what does he say? He says, quick, help the other guys out. So you guys ready for this? I pulled a 300-pound lineman out of the river. I am not making this up. You're wondering, how on earth do you do this? Well, here's actually the secret. If you're trying to pull somebody out of a river, you don't just pull them out. What you do is you grab a hold of their life preserver, you dunk them under the water, and then you pull and you allow the buoyancy of the water to help launch them up into the boat. Anyway, yeah, I'm not joking. The guy actually played for the Dallas Cowboys later, so I like to tell this story. The point is, when my brother rescued me, it was so that then I could begin to rescue those around me as well. And that is, again, the point of the story. The people of God, if you go back to Abraham, you realize, wait a minute, the people of God are rescued to be the rescuers, to be the means through which blessing comes to the nations. And so what you discover then is that the question then emerges, well, how are the people of Israel, after they are delivered from Egypt, how are they to bring blessing to the nations? And what we saw, and we saw this many months ago before we took the break, is they were called to bring blessing to the nations through demonstrating what beautiful community looks like. To demonstrate to the world what beautiful, good community looks like. That's the point of the 10 Commandments. You see, as soon as they're delivered from slavery in Egypt, God gives them the 10 Commandments, goes into this whole exposition of the law, and all of that is designed to help them to understand how to create a community that is beautiful and well ordered as a means of blessing the nations. Okay, now, what we discover is that the book of Deuteronomy, what we just read from, actually summarizes a lot of what takes place from Exodus on. You have Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and basically what happens is after God gives the 10 Commandments, he continues to give a whole host of other commandments. This is all at the same time when he's communicating through Moses to the people of Israel after they've been delivered from Egypt. He gives them all of these commands, and the passage that we read is in some respects a little bit of a summary of the kind of stuff you find in the book of Leviticus. I almost picked a passage from the book of Leviticus, but it was going to be like 8 chapters long, and I figured maybe we'd just go with the shorter version. So Deuteronomy is kind of summarizing what we find in that context in which he'd given the 10 Commandments, and then he continues to give more commands. The reason why I want to highlight that is because all of these strange commands that we're getting are still part of God's original plan, and that is for them to demonstrate what beautiful community looks like. So as weird as these things are, it's still within the context of the 10 Commandments, which is to demonstrate to the world what beautiful community looks like. Okay, so what emerges from this passage, and we're going to have to build kind of how this works out into demonstrating beautiful community to the nations. We've got to take it a step at a time. Okay, what emerges from this passage? If we kind of cut through all of the interesting details and just say what is at the heart of this passage, here's what we discover. The people of God are called to be culturally distinct. The people of God are called to be culturally distinct. And actually, verse 2, we see a little bit of an example of this. It says, "You shall not cut yourself or make any baldness on your foreheads for the dead." That particular command seems to be because of the fact that there were other nations in the area that were doing exactly this, and God wanted to have ways to draw a distinction between the Israelites and the nations around them. Okay, so all of this is pointing to this need to be culturally distinct from the nations around them. Okay, so here's where this becomes practical for us today. When we invite people to participate in the Christian faith, to become Christians, it's important that we recognize this. We are not just inviting them to believe certain things, but to embrace an entire way of life. You see, if somebody were to come and become a part of the Israelite community, they became a part of an entire way of life. It wasn't simply affirming certain doctrinal creeds, as important as that is. We must see it's more than that. In other words, it's embracing an entire cultural system. Now, to kind of jump ahead a little bit, and then we'll come back to this. Like when we start looking at our culture, our cultural system, what are we talking about? We're talking about the religious and cultural practices that we engage in that mark us out as distinct from those around us. The cultural and religious practices. So here's one of the things I'm talking about. I'm talking about like now, Sunday morning, church. I'm talking about when we gather together for community group and we study the Bible. I'm talking about when we participate in things like Christmas Eve and Easter. These religious cultural traditions, they are things that culturally mark us out as distinct from those around us. And this is important. It's important for us to realize that some people who are not a part of that, many of them actually need to kind of belong to the community before they'll start believing any of the things that we believe. They need to be able to participate in the activities that we are engaged in, and then oftentimes that can begin to be what enables them to rethink their thoughts and about what they believe. In other words, many people today will say this. They will say, "That is my church," before they will say, "He is my God." They'll say, "That's my church, those are my people," before they will ever say, "He is my God." I mean, I can think of one example in particular, a dear friend of mine, where she participated. This is a church that Laura and I served in for many years. And there's an individual who got very involved in the community, very involved in the church, worked in the tech ministry, actually helped to oversee, it was a bigger church, helped me oversee production. This was an individual who's very organized, realized I could use some help, came in, helped me, really played a tremendous role in helping to organize a lot of the things that we were doing, the systems that we were using in the church for the tech team and that kind of thing. And she just became a part of the whole community, and it wasn't until several years later that she professed faith in Christ. She belonged before she believed. People today need to belong before they will believe. Okay, but there's a problem here now, right? There's a problem with this. If this is true, people need to belong before they believe. There's a real problem that emerges, and it's a problem that we see here in Deuteronomy. Here's the problem. Many people think church and religious activities are just flat out weird. They just think it's weird. Guess what? It's not just pastors they think are weird. It's all of us. We're all weird, right? You tell many people, oh, well, you go to church? Like, all of a sudden, okay, this is getting a little weird. You gather together in people's homes and you study the Bible. Ooh, this is getting weird, right? To many people in our culture, it's weird. I mean, you tell somebody you go to church, you're part of a Bible study, you might as well tell them that when you get a rash on your arm, you take a live bird, dip it in the blood of a dead bird, then sprinkle the blood on your rash, and then let the live bird fly away. You might as well tell them that. You think I'm making that up, but that's actually in Leviticus. You want to see? This is another interesting little part of the law. The Lord said to Moses, spoke to Moses, saying, "This shall be the law of the leprous person for the day of his cleansing. He shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall go out of the camp, and the priest shall look. Then if the case of leprous disease is healed in the leprous person, the priest shall command them to take for him who is to be cleansed 2 live birds and cedar wood and scarlet yarn and hyssop, and the priest shall command them to kill one of the birds in an earthen vessel over fresh water. He shall take the live bird with the cedar wood and the scarlet yarn and the hyssop, and dip them and the live bird in the blood of the bird that was killed over the fresh water, and he shall sprinkle it 7 times on him who is to be cleansed of the leprous disease. Then he shall pronounce him clean, and shall let the living bird go into the open field." Friends, you just tell people you go to church, you might as well just tell them that's what you do. And people think that it's weird. Okay. So the question emerges then. There's a little bit of a tension emerging here, as you may notice here. The question is this: why does God call us to live different culturally, to be culturally distinct? Why does he call us to live differently if the goal is to reach those on the outside? You see the problem here? There's a tension here. Like, we're called to bless the nations, but we're called to engage in all these weird practices. People think it's all weird. Why does he do this? And here's the answer. When we live differently, we love differently. When we live differently, we love differently. In other words, when we engage in the religious practices, when we gather together for worship, when we gather together in community to study the scriptures, the goal is that those practices, as weird as they may be to those on the outside, will shape us into the kinds of people who love those on the outside in a way that they cannot deny. As I said, all of these weird laws that we find in Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and whatnot, they all fall on the heels of the 10 Commandments. They're all part and parcel of the same command on how to demonstrate beautiful community. And so we engage in these practices with the goal that they will shape us so that we will love people differently. And of course, the point is, in the end, it is the loving people differently that matters, not the religious practices we engage in. Or to put it yet another way, if our religious practices don't lead us to love differently, they are worthless. It doesn't matter how much we go to church. Doesn't matter how many Bible studies we're involved in. None of that makes a difference. If it doesn't change how we live, it's worthless. This is what emerges. The prophet Hosea highlights this. He says, here, God speaks through him and says, "For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." He's saying what I'm after is intimate knowledge of me, which is another way of talking about loving God, and steadfast love. That's what I desire, is steadfast love. What he's pointing at here is the two commandments, to love God and to love your neighbor. See, that's what I'm after. I'm not after the sacrificing of animals. I'm not after all of these things that I commanded you to do in the Levitical law. That's not ultimately what I'm after. I'm after, do you love? The practices we engage in don't lead us to live out of love, then they are worthless. Or yet another way of putting it is this: our religious activity has become worthless if we aren't willing to change those activities to accommodate those on the outside. You see this? If we aren't willing to change them, not get rid of them, but if we aren't willing to change these practices in order to accommodate those on the outside, then what has become clear is that those practices are more important to us than loving those on the outside. See? Again, we see this tension emerging, right? We're called to these religious practices, but then when these religious practices separate us from culture, then we find this tension because we're called to love our culture. And this tension actually just boils over in the New Testament. The reality is, one of the central questions that emerges in the New Testament is precisely, how are the people of God to relate to their surrounding cultures? Especially in light of the fact that the people of God, they grow out of the Jewish tradition. They grow out of that world. And so this big question emerges as the Christians are going out trying to engage the Gentiles, trying to engage those who, they don't follow the Levitical law. They're not a part of this. And so this question emerges, well, how do we be faithful to the law that has been given and yet also engage the people around us that it's drawing a wall between? I mean, the tension that emerges there is one of the central tensions in the New Testament. And what emerges time and time again is the need to accommodate the religious practices in order to engage those around us. So the question that I would want to ask us is this morning: are we willing to make changes in our church and in our religious practices in order to accommodate those on the outside? And what I would say is I'm really encouraged by what I have seen here at Calvary North Glen. The reality is that when this church voted as First Southern to become Calvary North Glen, that showed a willingness to make changes in our practices. And I've actually seen this play out. And I want to highlight one particular way. Unfortunately, the leader of this group isn't here this morning, but I'm going to say it anyways. I had a conversation with Al Courtney. He and I were talking, this is many months ago, and of course he led a community group, which consistently met time and time again prior to the service. And we were talking about that, and I was encouraging him in that. But you know what emerged from that? He said, we realized we needed some people to help with the hospitality, to help provide food and drinks and whatnot, to try to make it more accommodating, make it more welcoming to people when they come in. And so Al went and he spoke with his community group, and guess what they said? They said, you're right, that's more important. And so they changed. They stopped meeting before church on Sunday, and they have been the ones who have been providing treats for us. You see, that's doing exactly what this is talking about. I would suggest that community group, it bore fruit. Through the ministry that Al led, they got a hold of what all of this religion is about. It's about engaging those on the outside. You see, when the practices are working the way they're intended to, they actually shape us in ways that then enable us to accommodate those practices to reach those on the outside. Because in the end, what matters in terms of our distinctiveness is not our cultural and religious practices. What matters is the distinctiveness of our love. You know, the truth is, being culturally distinct is not actually all that distinct at all. Because everybody's culturally distinct to some degree. I mean, everybody's got their little culture. You get people coming from other countries. They come to America, and oh my gosh, they have 2 TVs. That is really weird. Right? Culturally distinct. I mean, everybody's culturally distinct. So we can't pat ourselves on the back and look how culturally distinct we are with our religious practices. That in itself isn't really distinct at all. What can be truly distinct is when we love differently. Okay. Let me just, okay. I thought I was going to skip this, but I just can't. It's too good. All right. We see this here in Colossians. Colossians chapter 3, we see that the distinctiveness of our love is ultimately what matters. Put on then, as God's chosen ones, here we see that same kind of language, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other, as the Lord has forgiven you, you also must forgive. Right? Here we get a picture of this beautiful community that is, in its essence, love. Okay. All of this then leads back to a central question. And it's a question I've already raised, but we got to come back to it again. If loving people, if loving people is what it's really all about, then once again, why does God call us to these religious practices that so often can end up causing a barrier? And to get at this, we've got to unpack a little bit of what's going on here in Deuteronomy. All right, so here in this passage, we have all this description of you can eat this animal, you can't eat this animal. Okay, what's going on here? Okay, the truth of the matter is there are lots of debates amongst Old Testament scholars about what precisely the meaning is here. But what seems to be critical is that it's the issue of cleanliness. That's the fundamental issue here. Is that there's this command to be clean. And, some animals are clean and some animals are unclean. Again, what is it that makes one animal clean, another animal unclean? There's debate. Some think it's hygienic reasons. Some think that it's related to, just simply related to the way other religions approached some of these animals. There's a lot of debate. Truthfully, I'm not sure that it really matters. What matters is simply that a distinction is being drawn between what is clean and what is unclean. And you find this theme of cleanliness running throughout the Levitical law, not just in terms of what animals you eat, right? There's in your house must be clean. There's mildew. What do you do when there's mildew? What do you do when you're unclean? It's all about cleanliness throughout the Levitical law. And here's what's interesting. Here's what emerges. Is that within the Israelite understanding of cleanliness, a person could be in one of 3 states. A person could be unclean, clean, or holy. Those were the 3 states that a person could be in. And what's interesting is that those 3 states also then related to the 3 types of people within the Israelite worldview. You had the Gentiles, who were unclean. You had the Israelites, who were clean. And then you had the priests, who were holy. So you have these 3 states of cleanliness. Now, some of you may remember from last week, we looked at the tabernacle, the construction of the tabernacle, which again is all part of this same section, same time in the life of the people of Israel. The construction of the tabernacle, the place where God comes and dwells. And what we discover is that there were 3 different kinds of material, 3 different kinds of metals. You had bronze, silver, and gold. And in the center of the tabernacle, the very place where God resides, was gold. And then as you move a little bit farther out, the furnishings tended to be made with silver. And then when you move even farther out, then it's made with bronze. What do you notice? 3 states. Same 3 states. And so we find over and over and over again that in their religious practices, that it was communicating to them this importance of cleanliness. And in reality then, all of these different religious practices that they engaged in, what it was doing is it was taking physical cleanliness and using it as an object lesson to remind them of the importance of spiritual cleanliness. It was simply there to remind them of the importance of being spiritually clean. It's a little bit like I have this wedding ring, and it's with me everywhere that I go. But all it's really there to do is to remind me of the commitment that I have made to my wife. In the same sense, all of these practices that the Israelites were engaging in was simply to remind them of the importance of understanding the notion of God's holiness, our sin before that holy God, and our need for to be clean before him. And so this was interwoven into all of their religious practices. Okay, so how does this translate in for us today? Religious activities that can cause cultural barriers with outsiders are the very practices that can shape us into the people who love outsiders better. You see, within the Israelite worldview, what was central was understanding this distance between them and God and the need to be made clean. But at the heart of the Christian faith is that in Jesus Christ, God has come. God died to forgive us of all of our sin, to forgive us of our uncleanliness, and to make us right in the presence of God. And so what our religious practices do today are designed to remind us of that reality. Everything that we do is designed to remind us that we are loved by God, that we are clean, that we can enter into the presence of God. So it's changed in terms of the focus. You see, the focus in the Old Testament Levitical law and religious practices was largely to highlight the distance between us and God. But now, because of the coming of Christ, our religious practices are designed to remind us that we are set free from that and are welcome to enter into the presence of God. And it's when we do that, when that reality, the reality of God's love, becomes imprinted on our hearts and our souls, this is then what enables us to love better. And so our cultural practices, you see, they're very different, right? This is why we don't do the same things that the Israelites did. But what we need to see from this is the importance of taking these religious practices and having them shaped by what we understand of the gospel, and then using that to work in our hearts. Here's what I'm getting at. This is why it's so important that we have church. This is why it's so important that we have community group. This is why it's so important that we study the Bible and study the scriptures every day, not because somehow that makes us clean, but rather to remind us that we're already clean because of the blood of Christ. To remind us that there isn't that distance between us and God. To remind us that we are loved by him no matter where we have gone, no matter what we have done, and that frees us to what? To love others. Look at this here again in Colossians chapter 3, passage I highlighted, but I want to read on a little bit. But starting at the beginning, once again, we see the centrality of love. It's love that is to truly make us distinct. Put on, then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and if anyone has a complaint against another, forgiving each other, as the Lord has forgiven you, so you must also forgive. Above all these things, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. Okay, so we see this again, this call to love. But then notice what it says right after that. It says, and let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you are called in one body, and be thankful. And then look at this. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your hearts to God. Do you see what it's saying? It's saying you're called to love. You're called to be compassionate. You're called to show humility. You're called to forgive others when they sin against you. Okay, well, how do I become the kind of person where that love is embodied in my life? Engage in these religious practices. Sing songs, sing hymns, engage in the teaching of the word, engage in these religious practices that can begin to shape you increasingly so that you will love those around us. So here's just what I'm getting at here. We need to get religious so we can love people better. We need to get religious so we can love people better. Now, I think that some of us might be here, and maybe you're here today, and the reality is when you hear that word religion, like the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Okay. Because you've had bad experiences with religion, right? Well, here's what I would say to that. I would say this. I would say that, let's see, if you had a bad experience with religion, it's a little bit like getting food poisoning at a restaurant. I want you to imagine you go to a restaurant and you get a hamburger and you get food poisoning and you are ridiculously sick. Here's what you're not going to say. You're not going to say, well, I'm never going to eat food again. Right? Yeah, you had a bad experience, so maybe don't go back to that restaurant. Okay? But it's not the food's fault. Food isn't the problem. The problem was maybe that restaurant, right? The same thing is true with religion. You see, just as food gives life to your body, it is engaging in these religious practices that can give life to your soul. If you have a bad religious experience somewhere, well, maybe that's not the place to go, but you still need to engage in those practices because they're precisely the ones that can feed your soul. So, friends, I want to encourage you as we move forward here in 2023, get your religion on. Think about 2023. What are some of the religious practices? How can you up your game? Right? Maybe it's carving out more time for you to be involved in your daily devotionals. Right? Again, not doing this as a way to get not to do this in order to prove anything to God. As I always say, the reason we engage in religion is not to get God to love us. It's to get us to love God. Right? The problem isn't whether or not God loves you. You know that, right? That is not the problem. The heart of the gospel is God loves you. The problem is, do we really love God? That's always the problem. And so we engage in these practices so that they can cultivate hearts that love God. So I want to ask you that question again. What are some practices that you can engage in 2023? This is a time of the year where we make New Year's resolutions. I would just encourage you to get your religion on this year.